Welcome back to another module of COM 3073. In part 2 of measurement, we're going to continue our discussion of measuring variables by discussing what we need to consider after we've located a measure of a variable in our hypothesis. We cover in this module the idea of validity and reliability as it relates to measures. Please make a point in your note that measurement validity and reliability is different from experimental validity, which we'll be talking about in a later video. All of the information will help you to select a measure that you will be embarking on in a research project. So let's get into the content of Module 6. So now that you learned some common types of scales in measurement, let's talk about the actual words and statements that make up the other part of the item. These statements or bipolar adjectives can be evaluated on two important bases: validity and reliability. When I say I'm evaluating the validity of a measure, I'm essentially asking whether the items of that measure truly do get at what I'm saying that variable is. For example, if I'm creating a newer version of the IQ or intelligence quotient test, but I only include items assessing one's basketball skills, then this measure would be evaluated poorly on the basis of validity because this new measure is not measuring what I'm saying it's measuring. Let's do a very short activity on validity. What if I told you that I was working on a study of loneliness and I needed to find a measure of it? I conceptualize or define loneliness as the feeling of being cut off or separated from others. I then found a 4-item measure in a journal article published by Carol Rusbolt in 1998 on Google Scholar. The 4 items used to assess loneliness are: I lack companionship, I often feel left out, I am prone to being bored, and I feel isolated from others. Do you notice something odd about this 4-item measure? Does one item stick out as not looking like the others? If you said the item I am prone to being bored does not on face sound like it measures the feeling of being cut off or separated from others, then you successfully identified an item that is said to likely contribute to this 4-item measure's poor validity. What would we do in such a situation? We just get rid of that item and turn it into a 3-item measure. Now that you have a better understanding of validity, let's turn our attention to reliability. Reliability is a term used to describe the consistency or trustworthiness of the items of a measure assessed or evaluated through repeated observations. Let's say the thing I want to measure is my body weight, which incidentally represents the most stressful part of my day. Let's say I go to my bathroom and get on my scale. At first, when I get on, it reads 185 pounds and I'm beaming from ear to ear. I then get off the scale, but I get back on just to confirm it wasn't a fluke, and now it says I'm 213 pounds. Confused, I get off, get back on, and now it reads 201 pounds. I do this one more time and now it reads 164 pounds. Something is definitely wrong with this scale. What, you ask? Well, it lacks reliability because each trial is giving me inconsistent results. So let's jump back to the loneliness measure example earlier. Now, with our 3-item measure, let's say we have participants complete it, asking each individual to rate how they feel at this current moment. If the item purportedly validly measures loneliness, but then we find that individuals are circling 4, 1, and even 5 without any consistency, then we'd likely conclude that the items are not internally reliable. Instead, we'd like to see people consistently scoring high 4s or 5s on all items if they are very lonely, medium around 3s, and maybe some 2s and 4s across the items if they are moderately lonely, and low on all items if they don't feel lonely at all. That would be an example of a reliable scale. Here's a visual illustration to help you to understand the concepts of validity and reliability even better. Suppose we were shooting a gun at a target. The bullseye in this case represents the core variable, and the bullets represent the items of a measure used to get at that core variable. If I take some shots at the target and the bullet holes were sprayed like birdshot, it essentially means that the items were neither reliable nor valid. But what if the bullet holes were in a tight pattern but way off the bullseye? We would say that this measure was reliable but not valid. If I generally was around the bullseye but not quite in a tight pattern, we would say that this measure was valid but not reliable. Finally, what we want to see in a measure is we have a tight grouping of the bullet holes near the center of the bullseye. In this case, it is the optimal situation because we have both high reliability and high validity. There are 4 ways to determine whether a measurement has high validity. We'll go over examples of these measurement validities in the coming section, but I wanted to foreshadow them here. In face validity, we're determining whether an item seems to be a reasonable indicator of the variable. In criterion-related validity, we use an external criterion, like say a known population, to determine whether our measure is valid. In content validity, we're asking whether the range of items captures the entire universe of a variable it's intending to measure. And finally, in construct validity, we're asking whether the items are associated with other variables in the way they are theoretically expected to be associated. The face validity of a measure is the extent to which the items and content of that measure appear to be appropriate for measuring the variable. Often when we evaluate face validity, it's done with an eyeball test where the researcher considers the definition and looks carefully at the items to see whether there's correspondence between the two. Consider the following measure of relational satisfaction created by Carol Rusbolt and her colleagues. She believes that relational satisfaction is indicated by the belief that individuals love their partner, feel the relationship is better than others, is close to ideal, and fulfills certain intimacy needs, among other things. If you as the researcher look at these items and say, yeah, that's pretty much what relational satisfaction is, then you would adopt the measure wholesale in your study. And I'll tell you that given the generally high face validity of Rusbolt's relational satisfaction measure, it's used quite a bit. There have been many times, however, in my career where I look at a measure and scratch my head thinking, what is this even measuring? These are the times when face validity is low and you need to remove items and add new ones, create your own measure, or find another existing measure. Concurrent validity is the extent to which your new measure corresponds to an established and well-validated measure of the same construct. How do you establish concurrent validity? Well, it's done in one of two ways. For example, if I were creating a new measure of marital satisfaction, my measure should be able to distinguish or be predictive of couples who have been in therapy for a while versus couples who are in the initial stages of going through intense couple therapy. The stages of therapy, of course, being the well-established external criterion on which the new measure of marital satisfaction is being validated. This is called known groups validity. Another way to establish concurrent validity is seeing the correspondence between your new measure and a measure of the same construct that already exists. Of course, if a measure of your construct already exists, you might ask yourself, why would I need to create a new one? It's because no measure is perfect. There are always improvements to items or tailored wording to a specific sample, like children, on which you might want to make modifications. Content validity is the extent to which a measure reflects the entire range or universe of the variable under investigation. If I'm interested in doing a study on internet gaming use disorder, by the way, something very real and recognized by the World Health Organization, I need to find a measure that taps into the entire universe of what internet gaming use disorder is. I do this because I already know that this variable has multiple dimensions to it. For example, it has an uncontrolled use dimension, which evaluates how much a person feels they have lost control over their internet gaming. It also has a withdrawal dimension, where people feel noxious psychological states when they're forced to be away from internet gaming. The point I'm making here is that a measure of internet gaming disorder would have at least a couple of items for each component listed. If it's missing, for instance, items that tap the preoccupation dimension, the content validity of the measure would be compromised. Construct validity is the extent to which measures exhibit strong relationships with responses of conceptually similar and dissimilar measures. To determine the construct validity of a measure, you would need to understand the theoretical relationships of your construct with other constructs out there. In this way, you can expect scores from your measure to correspond with measures of other variables. Let's return once again to the relational satisfaction measure. If I were interested in determining its construct validity, I would see whether there's a positive relationship between its scores and scores on a relational commitment measure, because I know those two variables should be strongly related, at least according to interdependence theory. Finding a strong positive correlation in this regard would give me what's called high convergent validity. I would also see whether there's a strong negative relationship between its scores and scores on a relational turbulence measure, because that's what's argued in relational turbulence theory. If I find a strong negative relationship between scores that should be negatively related, it gives me evidence of what's called discriminant validity. Reliability is the quality of the measurement method that suggests that scores are consistent within the same individual. It's essentially saying that if I score a 7 out of 7 on one item of a measure, I shouldn't score a 1 out of 7 on another item. There are several ways to determine reliability. The first is internal consistency, and it's simply a family of statistics used to determine the degree of correlation among items in a measure. Of course, the more correlated the items are, the higher the reliability will be. When looking for internal consistency, the most common metric is what's called Cronbach's alpha. You don't need to know the specifics of Cronbach's alpha, but please know that measures are considered reliable when the alpha reliability exceeds 0.70. The second is test-retest reliability, where you give your measure to someone at time point 1, wait for a determined period, and give the same person the same measure at time 2. Ideally, you would like to see high correspondence between the scores at the two time periods. The third is split half reliability, where you take your items from your measure and split them evenly in half. You put half the items in one part of your questionnaire and the other half in another part of your questionnaire. You then compare the items to see if there's correspondence between the two split halves. The greater the correspondence, the higher confidence we have that our measure is reliable. Three factors in particular affect how high the reliability of a measure is. There are ways a researcher can increase the reliability of a measure if it falls short of the conventional thresholds of a Cronbach's alpha of 0.70 or higher. The first is the number of items. The more items you have in a measure, the higher the reliability will be. You might be thinking to yourself, well, why then don't I have huge numbers of items so I can ensure reliability? Well, you need to balance the number of items in a measure with participant fatigue. If participants see the same items over and over in a questionnaire, they become tired or uninterested in their responses, and their data become less useful. The second factor that affects reliability is the degree of correlation among the items in the measure. If scores on items are completely uncorrelated, then your measure will lack reliability because in subsequent responses, there will be no consistency among the items. Therefore, it's best when scanning your measure to see if the items are asking about the same thing, but in different ways. The last thing that might affect reliability is whether different dimensions are being tapped in one measure. Remember my example of internet use disorder a little earlier. That had at least 5 subdimensions being evaluated in one measure. Because these subdimensions are different components of a larger latent variable, I would not just take an overall reliability of the measure because it's multidimensional. Instead, I would find a reliability for each subdimension of this variable. That's all I have for Module 6, but please also remember to read the textbook pages listed in the syllabus. We covered a lot of things today. Remember that the major premise of Modules 5 and 6 was to help you to start to think more sophisticatedly about how to measure variables in social scientific research. In this module, we talked about ways to evaluate measures you either find or have created on your own. We discussed the differences between validity and reliability as they relate to measurement, and ways to evaluate the validity of a measure and how to determine reliability. We also ended by talking about factors that influence reliability of a measure. As usual, please don't hesitate to contact me if any questions come up. Apart from that, please don't forget about this module's quiz. Have a great remainder of your week, and I look forward to seeing you for another session of COM 3073.